I am your host, obviously, Darlene Pawlik, and I'm going to talk about risk factors for sexual exploitation because I had a lot of the most common risk factors in my life and some not so common risk factors. The most common risk factor for sexual exploitation and sex trafficking is actually child sexual abuse. There have been studies that show about 90% of people who were trafficked for sex identified that they were also abused as children, sexually abused as children. 90%. That's incredible. Think about that next time a bill comes through that has to do with social services, DCYF or whatever you call it, and all the implications. Rescuing these kids from child sexual abuse. If you can get them on a different trajectory, God Almighty, please do it, because that trajectory is awful. I was sexually abused by my biological father from toddlerhood. I was manipulated and groomed by his mother and his sister to be silent, to be quiet. And I dissociated really well, so well that in the second grade, I was standing in the locker room and I woke to the teacher yelling my name and all of the students laughing because I wasn't responsive. I don't know what, I was doing there, but I would completely go away. And that's what Jasmine was talking about, that you have to do. So I was really good at it as a child. Another risk factor is poverty. My mom was married and divorced and married and divorced. And so there were times when we were living with family and didn't even have our own beds to sleep in. We didn't have things, we didn't have gloves, mittens, that sort of thing. Poverty is a really big risk factor because it just compounds the need. And we're all needy, but that compounds the need. Another risk factor for trafficking in particular is fatherlessness. As I mentioned, I was abused by my father, so when I was able to get away from him, I was fatherless. I was adopted by one of my mother's husbands. So I did have a father for a little bit, and I lived that double life because for some unknown reason, she still sent us back to our biological fathers for visits where he had access to us. And so this double life continued until I was about 12 years old when I didn't go anymore. I had the ability to stay home. But that meant that I was hanging around at home and hanging around my neighborhood. And she had a little apartment my mom had a little apartment in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Another risk factor is dysfunctional families. So there was all this tumultuous kind of stuff going on, and we moved almost every year. Even when she was married, we moved every year. So nothing was stable and steady. And at that point, I was fatherless. We, again, were poor, so other people would come to the apartment, uncles, friends, whatever. And one of her brothers molested me when I was 13, and that's when my world spun out of control. I started skipping school, doing drugs. I ran away, all that kind of stuff. I actually left school in the 6th grade. Left, not to return. I was in and out of foster care. I had been arrested numerous times for all kinds of things, but mostly for prostitution. Put in detention centers, foster care, group home. Recidivism for that sort of thing is big because we're living on this massive soup in our brains of all these neurochemicals because that constant stress and that constant trauma has created this feedback loop. And so when I was taken out of that situation and put in a foster home, I was like, what am I going to do here? Okay, I'll sleep for the night, have a couple of meals, see you later. That was it. I didn't know that it was because this soup was rolling around in my brain that I couldn't calm down. I had to have the stress. I had to have that to keep going. Like I couldn't deal with it. It was awful. It was inside of me. It wasn't external. So at 13, I'm hanging around the neighborhood, and this handsome bodybuilder comes to the neighborhood and pretends like he's talking to everybody. Well, I mean, he really was talking to everybody, but I didn't realize I was being targeted. He was very kind and just carried on conversations, and it was friendly. He never imposed on me. He said, if you never need anything, here's my phone number. He never took my phone number. I don't need anything. I'm fine. Everything's good. He had the quintessential pimp car. He had a black Cadillac with red leather interior. It was gorgeous, and like I said, he was a bodybuilder. Like, he was very impressive if you're a 13-year-old girl. And he liked me as a friend. Like, he was my friend. This is so cool. And so it wasn't long before the cold New England winter set in, and I was in his car, and we were having conversations. And then soon after that, I was in his bed. And it didn't take him long, I would say 9 months, before he had me ready. And then on my birthday, my mom came home, and I'm like, it's my birthday. She threw 2 crumpled up dollars on the table, and I was devastated. We'd been fighting, I'd been running away, I'd been stealing from her, all kinds of stuff. There was really no reason for her to want to do anything for me for my birthday, but I still had that sense of entitlement. It's my birthday. You're not even giving me a card? Nothing? So I called him, and he sold me that day to a small businessman from Atkinson, New Hampshire. And that started 4 years of in and out of the control of various pimps, gang rapes, all just every sort of deprivation you can think of. I went days without food. I ate Valium like they were Tic Tacs. I had those spaghetti jars full of Quaaludes and cocaine that I would run. I ran money for the organized crime bosses. I ran everything that you could think of. I was a cigarette girl in a bar at 15 years old, in stiletto heels and a little tiny red shiny leotard. And all of this time, in 4 years, nobody sat me down and said, hey, what's going on? Except one nurse in the hospital when I was hospitalized with gonorrhea. I had it so bad I was hospitalized with gonorrhea. I had all kinds of stuff going on. But she said to me, so what are you doing? What are you doing? And I told her. But there was no word for it. There was no system in place. There was nothing she could do. So they just released me. So I just went back to it. I was 16 at that time. When I was 17, I was sold to one man as a so-called house pet. No more rapes. No more living on the street. I didn't have those worries. I got a little job at a pizza store. So over the course of about 4 months, those chemicals started to sort of dissipate. It was still awful, but it was less awful. And so as I was starting to calm down, he'd always told me, if you get pregnant, you have to have an abortion. I'm like, I've been used all this time. I haven't gotten pregnant yet. There's no worries. But of course, I got pregnant. And he said, well, you have to have an abortion. And I'm like, begging him on my hands and knees, please. I don't want to do this. I wanted to be a mom since I was like 2. Like, no, I don't want to do this. And by a miracle, I convinced him that I'd had the abortion because he'd told me about other girls that he'd forced to abort, and he let them go after. So I was like, that's my plan. I called a social worker that had been my key tracker when I was a runaway. She found a home for unwed mothers. I pretended to go to the appointment, convinced him it happened, and I got away from him. So here I am, just turned 18, in a home for unwed mothers. I was a mess. I was such a mess. So there's 4 of us girls living there, vomiting all the time, fighting all the time about who's going to clean the toilet because we're vomiting all the time. It was awful. But she was so kind. And she taught us how to calm down when we were fighting. And she taught us how to be still when we needed to be still. And honestly, that was the first time that I knew that there were good people in the world who didn't have anything to gain by being kind to other people. I was 18. Everybody else had an agenda, or like my mom took care of us out of a sense of duty. It was her duty. Everybody else had a job to do, even the social worker that I talked about. Now, of course, I know she was a genuinely good person. She was off hours when she brought me to that home for mothers. That was not something she had to do. And I love her. We are going to have a lunch date on Monday. She's wonderful. But for you, what difference does my story make to you? When we've got a bill coming before you that impacts the lives of children in Department of Health and Human Services or in Child and Family Law, consider that runaway, that dysfunctional family. Consider what impact that law is going to have on the recidivism for runaways or on the continued abuse that could happen. This is why we're here today. We want you to take this stuff and put it into practical use. We didn't come here to break your heart or to have an agenda or to tell you what to do, but to illuminate these different issues so that you can take it back to your committees, whatever committees they may be, and restore the innate dignity that's due every person with the laws that you create. So I talked about child sexual abuse, poverty, dysfunctional families, fatherlessness. There was one that is an unusual one, but I think it bears telling for the reason that it's ubiquitous. So I was conceived as through an act of rape. So in growing up, I felt worth less than other people when I found out, because I was kind of young when I found out. So in my mind, I was conceived from a criminal act, used and abused from toddlerhood. Like, my body was just a thing. It wasn't worth anything. And that, of course, set me up to be an easy target. I mean, it's probably an invisible stamp on my head, right? But anyone can feel that unworthiness. Maybe your nose is too big. Maybe your car is too small. Maybe your house is on the wrong side of the town. There's no one reason, and millions of reasons, that anyone could feel unworthy of love and unworthy to be taken care of, and millions of reasons. So I don't know, when you're in a committee meeting, if that kind of a thing could impact something that you're doing, but there are times when in your lives that will be something that you can impact. Reaching out to that kid who seems so lost, or that teenager who's just having a fit all the time and really not paying attention to anything. They're not going to school. Find out what's wrong. Find out what the deal is and let them know that you genuinely care, so that they aren't experiencing that particular vulnerability, because that pimp will find any vulnerability he can. He's going to find it, and it'll take his time. And there are women who pimp too, and that's mind-boggling and tragic, but it happens. Before I open to question and answers, because that's what we're going to do next, I just want you to know that you have my immense respect and gratitude for being here today, because I know some of you are actually on vacation, like literally from your jobs, and I appreciate your coming here. I appreciate you and all that you do for the state of New Hampshire, and I just want to thank you. Thank you, and you should all be giving yourselves a hand. Thank you.